as Socio-Economic Inequalities. Uh, we have a diverse array of papers which will be presented by a good uh, group of scholars. The session will be chaired by Professor Jayan Jose Thomas, a beloved professor of economics at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. His research deals with various issues related to the development, labor, industrialization, and macroeconomy. Professor Jayan is also a former member of the Kerala State Planning Board. And the speakers we have in this session are Venna Abhilash from JNU. He is a historian of modern South Asia, specializing in the political and cultural history of the Deccan and South India in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And his doctoral thesis unpacks the intricate interplay of caste, religion, and political power in the princely Deccan.
We also have here with us Professor Ishan Anand. He's an assistant professor of economics in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences here at IIT Delhi. His areas of interest are inequality, caste, agriculture, and development.
Also, we have the co-author with Professor Ishan, Saket, who is also one of the members of the editorial board of Economic and Political Weekly. He works on modern and social history. And the final presentation of this session is of Professor Amit Thorat, who is an assistant professor of economics at the Center for the Study of Regional Development at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And earlier, he was part of the India National Council for Applied Economics Research. And currently, he is working on understanding people's beliefs around personal and social identity in India and its implications for social behavior, individual distress, and economic outcomes. So now, without any delay, I would request Professor Jayan to proceed further.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And I would like to first of all congratulate the organizers, Divya, Yashpal, Dickens, for organizing this very important conference. I think what I find particularly striking about the objective of your conference is that you are trying to understand the structures and systems of inequality. And this is an aspect which has been dealt with much in the economics literature as well, which is why it's important for us. Amartya Sen has actually written about the coupling of disadvantages. Typically, a socially disadvantaged household is also a household that is asset poor, landless, and a country or a region like India, which has underinvested in health and education, means the children of these households are denied opportunities for schooling, higher education, and denied opportunities for upward mobility. And if you look at our economic growth over the last few years, one striking aspect is the slow growth of employment, especially regular employment. And we also understand there is a slow growth of opportunities for higher education. So clearly, this is another manifestation of this coupling of disadvantages, which was mentioned. So I think so. I'm sure there is going to be much more from the three speakers, who are all well known and respected in their fields. Abhilash is here, Amit and Ishan and Saket. So we have 20 minutes for each speaker. I think you can start with.
No, PowerPoint is there. It's starting here. Good afternoon to all the attendees here at CPCR2. I'm Venna Abhilash. I would like to thank Dwivedi, Yashpal Jogdand, and Dickens Leonard for inviting me to present my paper titled Manu, Smriti and the Racial Genius, Racialization of Caste Endogamy, Racialization, Caste Endogamy and Anti-Caste Politics in Princely Hyderabad, 1922 to 1936. Caste continues to profoundly shape contemporary Indian public life, with endogamy serving as a foundational institution that upholds caste hierarchies. Expressions like elite Dalit and Savarna sophistication reflect the tensions surrounding caste privilege and mobility in modern India. These are not merely post-colonial constructs, but are rooted in the socio-political debates of colonial South Asia, shaped by Hindu reform and anti-caste politics. In this presentation, I focus on Hyderabad during the 1920s and 30s, a critical period when Hindu reformers and Ambedkar politics clashed over the institution of caste endogamy. I analyze these shifts through two key approaches: a comparative reading of the 1926 presidential speech addressed by Sarla Devi Chaudhrani, and the correspondence between the Secunderabad-based Arya Samajist Baji Krishnan Rao and Dr. Ambedkar in Bombay in 1935. Chaudhrani, in her speech, articulated a vision of racialized caste endogamy as central to Hindu civilization, while Baji Kishan Rao's intermarriage proposal to Dr. Ambedkar reflected the influence of Ambedkar politics in the following the Yola Declaration. But this shift between the 1926 speech and the marriage proposal of Baji Krishan Rao is facilitated by the transformation in the Adi identity discourse due to the impact of the Ambedkar discourse itself. My analysis highlights how these ideological contestations reshaped caste, community, and nationhood, or the social basis of political compacts during this transformative period. So I begin with the first section, which is racialization of caste endogamy, which Sarla Devi dubbed as racial genius. In her speech to Hindi reformers in Hyderabad in 1926, she laid out her main objective was to restore what she called the primacy of the Brahmin within the Hindu social order and in the politics of Hindu social reform. Colonial modernity fostered an egalitarian discourse within the colonial public sphere, enabling leaders from diverse caste groups, Dalit, Shudra, and Baniya, communities to articulate distinct visions of social reform. As a result, these reform movements significantly eroded the Brahmins' traditional moral and social dominance, challenging their exclusive authority to shape Hindu practices and institutions. The entry of other castes into the modern colonial public sphere through the reform discourse compelled Sarla Devi Chaudhrani to articulate the restoration of the primacy of Brahmin as one of the central mandates of Hindu social reform. For her, the racialization of caste endogamy was central to this project of establishing the Brahmin's position at the helm of Hindu reform politics. To make this case, Sarla Devi harked back to ancient times to show how Brahminical exclusivity was constructed to racialization of endogamy. And she showed the link between racialization of caste and caste endogamy with this key extract. The Varna system, as found in Manu, is merely an attempt to codify the customary law of a people bristling with genius and the fullness of life and vigor, just settled in a new land. Many of the aborigines of those days were as unevolved species of humanity as their present descendants, the Santals, the Kols, and others, according to the laws of heredity and eugenics. Intermarriage with them would have bred an inferior race of men. Hence, there was an instinctive, natural aversion of the superior races against marital relations with them, though the exclusion from the fold of humanity, much less of untouchability, was never thought of. On the contrary, they were counted as the fourth class from whom service was acceptable, there being no fifth. This passage clearly presents the Aryans as a superior race and the Adivasis as an inferior race and invokes the so-called laws of eugenics and heredity for restrictions on intermarriage. This, for Sarla Devi, constitutes the first ground for restrictions on intermarriage. And she moves to the second ground of invoking labor servitude. Labor servitude, which is present in the statement that the transformation of Santals and Kols into the fourth Varna from whom service was acceptable. And in the subsequent statement she makes from this extract that marriage relations with the laboring classes was not countenanced or approved. This constitutes the second ground, labor servitude. And the third ground which Sarla Devi invokes in a subsequent extract is political sovereignty. It means that the Aryans, when contracting marriage relations with non-Aryans, intermarriages could happen between them only if the non-Aryans could accept the political sovereignty of the Aryans. Now, with the category of political sovereignty, she's moving from the category of tribe to caste and establishes political sovereignty as a mediating category from defining the relation between Aryans and non-Aryans to the coming of a broader category of high caste exclusivity, in which marriage relations are still central. And with this political sovereignty, she also introduces, but Now, with the first three categories of racial superiority, labor servitude, and political sovereignty, she comes and to the congealed category of the wider category called culture. And here, culture encapsulated the three grounds of racial superiority, labor servitude, and political sovereignty. And she invokes again in the context of intermarriages when she comments that alliances with the original races were considered okay if if they're equally strong and cultured as the Aryans. Now here, culture as a foundational category for regulating caste endogamy and reinforcing caste exclusivity is born. And not only that, it is a category which well represents the coming of caste endogamy. Here I would like to foreground two important theses. The Ambedkar thesis of the foundational role of caste endogamy in caste endogamy as a mechanism of social closure upon an originally undifferentiated uh, population. Second, from the keynote address of Professor Balivar yesterday, we see that with the invocation of culture, we see a movement from biological racism to cultural racism. And with this culture category, after she invokes a culture category, Sarla Devi moves further to place one central genetic material as the foundation for high caste exclusivity, which is Brahmin blood. Brahmin blood here plays two functions. Reinforcing the high caste exclusivity as marriages between high caste took among themselves, and second, as the blood percolated down to the general population, which is the downward filtration theory, we also see the raising of the common racial stock of the general population or the common clay. Now, this establishment of Brahmin exclusivity through racialization and the broader coming of caste endogamy is central for Sarla Devi to assert, which I discuss in the next section of the race ideal. With this race ideal, she enters the colonial landscape of the 1920s. Race ideal here means the presence of the Brahmin race within the larger Hindu race. Now we are properly in the colonial period, and where the politics of the Hindu identity is determining is pressing on the race as a concept. And here we see that she makes with the race ideal, she makes a primacy of the. She states that Brahmin should always be at the pinnacle of the caste hierarchy. The exclusiveness should always be maintained, and she exhorts Hindu social reformers to even create a new race of Brahmins like Parshurama did in the past. Now, clearly, Sarla Devi is influenced by the coming of colonial modernity and its dramatic expansion by anti-caste discourse and the social leveling it brought about in the colonial period. This has to be borne in mind when Sarla Devi mutes the concept of the race ideal. And the race ideal, how does she define it? The Brahmin is the keynote of the Hindu social music, the sa of the sarigama of the race. Unless this principal note is properly tuned and kept up to the standard pitch by the tuning fork of the race ideal, the whole social symphony of the Hindu is bound to be played false. Clearly, social symphony is caste hierarchy with the Brahmin at the top of the hierarchy. Central to our framework is the idea that caste exclusivity must translate into Hindu reform, reinforcing the Brahmin's moral leadership in the reform terrain. Sarla Devi justified the Brahmin's moral leadership in Hindu reform by invoking the ancient figure of Agastya, who she claimed turned out good, turned out cultured Aryans from good aboriginal materials. And this, the link between race, civilization, and Brahminical supremacy is what she brought to the reform landscape. That is important for her to dress up Hindu reform, which was essentially about removing unequal practices in order to place social equality as a basis for political equality in the times of nationalism. She dresses up a civilizing mission by Brahmin reformers with the following extra: the the modern Brahmin man or woman should be educated up to the idea that Brahminism does not consist in mere conventional physical cleanliness or intellectual acuteness, but that Brahmanhood connotes a heart to embrace the unclean, the will to cleanse the impure, the effort to civilize the barbarous, and make of him a better man physically, morally, and intellectually than he was found. Now, clearly, Sarla Devi dramatically expands the colonial discourse on race to include notions of purity and pollution too, with her statement of embrace the unclean and the will to cleanse. And yes, with this, this is this entire paradigm on race, caste, and Hindu social reform, which was jettisoned with the coming of the Ambedkar discourse in the early 1930s. Here, Sarla Devi Chaudhrani was not only responding, was not only trying to reassert the primacy of the Brahmin due to the leveling of leveling brought out by the modern colonial discourse, but she was also responding to the Adi identity discourse, which championed the idea of the original inhabitants versus the cunning Aryans who subjugated them and they came from abroad. Here, in his speech, in the first Adi Hindu conference in 1922 in Hyderabad, Bhagirathi Verma, the founder of the Dalit movement in Hyderabad, problematized through the original inhabitants theory, problematized the presence of the fifth Varna in the Hindu social order, and how does this fifth Varna fit into the 4-4 Varna system. Now, this oppositional consciousness, which clearly shows between Aryan and original inhabitants, was broadly a broad shift occurred with the entry of Ambedkar into the colonial landscape. In the 1931 speech of Bhagirathi Verma at the All India Adi Hindu Conference in 1931, clearly reflects this shift. And this shift shows that Bhagirathi Verma started to address Dalits as depressed classes and the Aryans as the caste Hindus. Not only is a shift present in this, but also the broad recourse to terms of debate from race and civilization to the coming of concrete categories like the rise of slavery and separate electorate as tropes in Dalit politics mediates this shift. And Bhagirathi Verma clearly interrogated and interpellated the concept of adult franchise as a panacea for all the inequalities that Dalits are facing due to the caste order. By showing that Dalits are scattered everywhere as a minority throughout the length and breadth of India, he asked how could adult franchise be a panacea for the woes of Dalits. Instead, he muted by law determined representation in the legislative bodies and executive bodies. So this coming of concrete constitutional categories very clearly shows the shift in the Adi Hindu discourse from 1922 to 1931. It is this shift in race and civilization that Dr. Ambedkar brought to the colonial landscape, which got thoroughly cemented with the Yola Declaration and caused a breach in the endogamous Varna order. Dr. Ambedkar in this Yola Declaration stated that though I was born a Hindu, I will not die as one. He exhorted his fellow Dalits to choose any religion that would give equality status. This iconic declaration in colonial India opened up the link between conversion, kinship, and citizenship, and caused a paradigm shift in the in the thinking of Hindu reformers that I've laid out in the first two sections. And a reflection of this is the intermarriage scheme proposed by Baji Krishan Rao, an Arya Samaj based in Secunderabad, in his correspondence with Dr. Ambedkar. He stated two conditions in his letter. One was, as high class Harijans are as equal and capable as high caste Hindus, as capable and worthy as high caste Hindus, marriages can take place between high class Harijans and caste Hindus. The second condition was that while the high class Harijan is coming in contact with the endogamous world of the Brahminical elite, he should also be subject to the culture test, which is he or she should be evaluated by the ideals of guna, karma, and swabhava. Very clearly, it's a continuation in the Hindu reformers line of thought of pitting the so-called high-class Harijan versus the so-called low-class Harijan, thereby reinforcing labor servitude as a criteria for curbing intermarriages. Second, also by invoking culture, which I showed as arrived as a mediating category for the arrival of the broad caste exclusivity through caste endogamy. He reiterated the same tropes which Sarla Devi utilized in this, but there's a significant difference. The high class Harijan trope is a definite breach in the endogamous caste order, is what I argue in this paper. And as Sarla Devi has argued, that political conditions determine caste endogamy, it is the rise of Dalits as a national political minority in the 1930s through the RTI, through the 1932 Communal Award, and most importantly, the Yola Declaration, which shows that the grandiloquent, though futile attempt of Baji Krishan Rao was just hot air. So, in this case, hence, the Yola Declaration caused a definite breach in the caste order. With this, I sum up my paper, and in conclusion, I reiterate the centrality of caste endogamy and the Ambedkar thesis of caste endogamy as a foundation for caste hierarchy, and the importance of anti-caste visions in proposing alternative social organizations through the political energies of the Dalit movement in curbing endogamy and releasing the political energies of exogamy. And with this, what I started with, that from the high class Harijan in 1935 to the elite Dalit and Savarna sophistication, which show the constant anxiety over the need to maintain caste, how should social interaction and social intercourse take place, and also the constant need for Savarna sophistication to reflect caste endogamy or the resolve to maintain caste endogamy, shows the broad shift from the high class Harijan to the Savannah sophistication in 2025. And here we see, and the concept note, I hope I added to it by looking at the changing social morphologies that this conference titled Architectures of Inequalities try to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhilash, for such a excellent presentation. I think clearly it was showing how these discussions in the early part of the 20th century were kind of reinforcing the social differences. Also, a time of, major revolutionary changes in the political sphere, but those political changes were probably not translating into the social sphere. I think that is what your paper suggests. We should now go to the next presentation, Ishan and Saket.
Through their work, inspiring even an economist like me to look at caste seriously. The paper, yeah. So the paper is okay. So I'm trying to change. Yeah. So the motivation behind this paper was very simple. We started looking at economics of caste, Saket and I, and we figured that a lot more needs to be done on the material aspects of caste from economists, from that perspective, from that lens. And while there has been in the last 20-30 years, there has been advances. We have a lot more. We have pushed our understanding of the labor market disparities, access to education, health, etc., etc. We found a gaping hole in the history of Indian economic thought or history of economic thought as far as caste is concerned. So we started looking at that, and then we said, okay, why not revisit the origins of Indian economics? So that was our motivation, and in doing so, we realized that there are two sort of major errors of omission and commission as far as the literature on the Indian economic thought is concerned, or the origins of Indian economics is concerned. And the two major sort of limitations of that literature, the errors of omission and commission, were one, that there is hardly any voice, hardly any anti-caste voice who is considered as an economist or who is given any place in the history of Indian economic thought, including Ambedkar, who ironically is an economist by training. But in several of the books and literature on HET, Indian history of economic thought, we just ignore anti-caste thinkers. That was the first sort of limitation we explored. And the second was the fact that when these other economists, or the early nationalist thinkers, those who were credited with the origins of Indian economics, the Narojis, Dutts, Ranade, the Gokhales, etc., in their analysis, caste plays a rather limited role. Ranade, of course, has a lot more to say on caste as a social reformer, but as a mechanism which perpetuates advantage and disadvantage in the society, it hardly plays any role in these early nationalist thinkers. So that is our motivation. And then there is this quote from a book by Ajit Dasgupta, who is a historian of economic thought, who says, yes, there are several people and there are several economic thoughts, but we cannot possibly include all of them. All thoughts are not equally worthy of being put on record. So that is where we come in, and we'll present our analysis and we'll go back to this question towards the end, and we'll see if we can address that. So, the origins of Indian economics, I'll not spend much time on it, but very quickly, while Dutt and Naraji are writing in the late 18th century, they are seeing the famines, they are seeing rise in poverty. Naraji famously calculated India's. He was the first to calculate India's per capita income, 20 rupees, and that created quite uproar. At the time this is happening, Ranade gives this famous lecture in the Deccan College in Pune and says, look, what the British are doing is that they are using the tenets of classical political economy. They're trying to implement those policies here, and this is not done because the Indian poverty is rising through various mechanisms. And the mechanisms, I don't want to go into a great detail here, but essentially they were talking about deindustrialization because of laissez-faire free trade policies. They were talking about famines and mismanagements, and Naroji, of course, famously was talking about the drain of wealth. Now, and land revenue policies. So that is somebody who spends a lot of time on land revenue policies and these taxations, which are sort of hampering the Indian economy. But the major argument from these nationalists was, look, there is this colonial regime that is exploitative, that is setting our economy back. And if we have to understand our economy, it has to be through a national lens. And to think that one classical political economy by the likes of Mills and Ricardo's, and the principles can be used all time, all places, is just false. And we will have to take into account Indian context and Indian, ethnic, social, ethical, and economic differences, etc. So that is where the nationalists are coming in. But as I said in the beginning, the voices from the margins are actually missing from this discourse. So we pick up any book on history of economic thought, and then we find there is no voice from the margin here. Of course, in other disciplines. So O'Hanlon later on argues that, look, even historians have not given them a great deal of attention, like we have looked at the nationalists. Omvet also makes a similar case. But so that is one problem, and the other problem, as I said, so we'll pick up the example of education. So again, there are some quotes here where Dutt and Naraji, who have benefited from imperial education in the cities of Kolkata and Bombay Presidency and Madras, scholars like them, they so what happens if there are no voices often from the margins? This is what happens. They, in several places, they of course have their complaints against the British, but they are really, really grateful for the education that the British are departing in India. And we'll see in a minute how, if there was a voice from the margin or the voice of the margin, they would have had a different take. So here we want to compare these early nationalist thinkers with Phule, who is of course their contemporary. Similar sort of geographical and spatial location as well. So Phule is writing in Pune, as is Ranade. They are also corresponding letters, so on and so forth. Now, Phule's, there are a few main texts, slavery, of course, Gulamgiri, Cultivator's Whipcord, and then there are some other poems and letters and representations to the commission. What we do is a very narrow and selective reading of the texts that we feel is closely related to the material aspects of caste. So a lot of, while Gulamgiri is an important text, our focus is rather narrow on his writings on the material aspects. So Cultivator's Whipcord, of course, plays a very important role in our analysis. So does his representation to the Education Commission, chaired by Hunter. Now, Cultivator's Whipcord, just a sort of anecdote for those of you who may not know, Ambedkar has had this difficulty in, giving the famous speech, Annihilation of Caste, because the invitation was cancelled. Phule faced a similar issue. He published the 2 chapters, and then Phule's colleagues thought, this is far too radical. So we'll not publish the rest of the 3 chapters, and then later it came as a book. In Phule's work, if we read his texts, he presents a dichotomous structure of the oppressor and the oppressed. The oppressed in Phule is the Shudra, Ati Shudra, and the oppressor, typically, he pits the Shudra, Ati Shudra vis-a-vis the Bhatjis and the Shethjis, the priests and the moneylenders. And the Bhatji plays a very, very important role. The priests play a very, very important role in this structure. The economic analysis of Phule is deeply embedded in the social, which in turn is embedded in the religious. his analysis is also deeply intersectional. So Phule, was a lot of his writing is clearly gendered. He has a great deal of analysis of the gendered issues of the time, and he presents a moral and economic critique of an order which he feels is deeply unjust. So let's now look at Phule, and for some of you who may not have read it, there are some interesting quotations. If you would follow. So, Phule has placed a lot of emphasis both in his writings and his praxis, along with Savitribai Phule on education, right? Opening of schools for women, for Mahar and Mang students, and so on. Now, in Phule, education plays a rather important role because it is linked very, very closely to the deprivation of Shudra Ati Shudra. It is important for both intrinsic and instrumental reasons. So Phule goes on, and Phule's writing is, it's a great read. He's extremely sarcastic, he's witty, he's funny, he's extremely hard-hitting. He's trying to, shock the readers and tell them what is going on in this great narrative. Phule talks a lot in several places about how the lack of knowledge, lack of education is very, very closely tied with occupational structures, status, mobility, and he goes on to give several examples of why the Shudra and Ati Shudras who are getting impacted by the British policy are just not able to shift and join other sectors because that opportunity, educational opportunity, is just not available. Now, here Phule also brings about a great moral critique. So he's saying, look, the British are collecting these taxes, much of which is coming from the riots, the coats, the peasants, their blood and sweat. But what they're doing is spending the money mainly on higher education. And higher education in turn is monopolized by the Brahmins. And that essentially means the sidelining of this huge mass of Shudra Ati Shudra from the educational process at all. He also says that the British seems to be following this, utopia that if we do educate the high class sections, then the education will ultimately trickle down. But Phule argues that it is not in the interest of the higher classes, the Brahmins, to trickle education down, and he says, look, it has to be the government which has to inculcate a taste for education among the Shudra Ati Shudras, and it should not just be formal literacy or formal education. Phule spends a great deal talking about democratization of education. So who should actually be the teacher? What should be the teaching method? What should be taught in schools? And then we'll come to the recommendations in a bit. But essentially, he argues the teachers have to come from the same section as the students. And again, we'll talk about it a little more. And now, Whipcord, the text is largely about the fate of the peasantry, and we discovered that there is some. So Phule actually maintains in the Marathi text that he is not talking about other segments. So he is not talking about the rich among the Shudras. He is not talking about the Mahars and the monks. But somehow the English translation misses Mahars and the monks in G.P. Deshpande's. So if you read that, is the English translation, it may feel as if Phule is not aware that there are these other classes, and Phule is just focusing on one class, whereas that is not the case. He says, look, I'm aware, but as of now I'll just focus on this community of peasants. And he sort of highlights three main aspects of exploitation of the peasantry. The three aspects are through rituals. The other is describes the production process, and then he argues that there is really a lack of, or the nature of the state intervention is such that it is putting the peasants at a great disadvantage. Let's briefly look at these three. The first is, Phule spends a lot of time on Dakshina, and again his writing is, so he talks about in a couple of chapters actually about all sorts of occasions which are used by the then Brahmins, the Shethji, the Bhatjis, for using Dakshina as a tool of exploitation and expropriation. And again, I don't want to go into the occasions, but the occasions could be full moon, it could be no moon, it could be a new house, it could be a festival, it could be a death, birth, women getting menstruation, it could be anything at all, right? And then he says, okay, but why is it that the letterless farmers who have so little are giving so much to these cunning Brahmins. And he says, look, it is entirely made possible because of lack of education, which in turn is embedded in the religious texts and the Manusmrita and the religious text of the time. And he is really harsh on the British government there. While he's appealing to the British government, he's also arguing, the British government is not doing nearly enough to get us out of this our misery. About the production condition. Now, I talked about the nationalists who have talked a great deal about deindustrialization. All of these elements, deindustrialization, pauperization, enclosures, are there in Phule. So, for instance, if you read the quotes, he actually says, the British are coming into India with their cheap goods. So the Indian peasants and weavers and the julas and the moments have nowhere to, they are not able to sell. And the Indian farmers, their lands have been taken away by the forest department. And because of this enclosure, you don't even have the option of livestock grazing. So there is a great deal of description in narrative form, agreed, but there is a great deal of description. What is, it's very hard to think of this as non-economic processes, right? And he goes on to talk about land fragmentation, economic holdings, holdings, agricultural holdings being uneconomic, irrigation facilities not being enough, and all of this affecting, basically these are the production conditions that are hampering the peasantry. He also spends some time on production relations. So yes, the peasantry faces issues vis-a-vis productive forces, but what about production relations? What about the social relations? And Phule is again very, very categorical. He lists examples. So for instance, if there's a dispute between the peasants, or if there's a dispute between the moneylender and the peasants, where would the peasant go? And again, he has this wonderful description of the village patil, the kulkarni, the judges, the judiciary, the police, everybody forming an excess from the same caste and community. And these workings essentially as caste networks, these are spaces of exclusion. So productive forces, production relation, and that actually in Phule is what is the problem with the peasantry. And Phule was writing just in the aftermath of the Deccan riots, where the peasantry is suffering, and the Orissa famine has begun in 1856. So that is a time of famine and distress and peasant riots. And Phule's writings are very, very categorical about what ails the Indian peasantry, particularly in the province that he is writing. Now, quickly moving forward, his gendered analysis. Now, Phule again in his praxis, he played a huge role in promoting female education, but he's acutely aware that there are these intersectional processes, and there is this wonderful quote in Whipcord where he says, Shudra women do a lot more work than Brahmin women, and you have to understand what they go through. Of course, he later does talk about enforced Brahmin widowhood. He gives recommendations to commissions on banning child marriage, promoting female education, but he has an extremely clear understanding of the intersectional caste class gender processes. Now, coming to his recommendations, so towards the end of Whipcord, Phule has actually a list of what, it's kind of a manifesto, what he would like to see. And, Phule's village is not a harmonious, self-sufficient village where there is no conflict. It is ridden with class and caste conflict. Phule's recommendation on agrarian economy are actually, extremely insightful. He says, look, you have to spend more on irrigation, on agricultural trips. You have to, if there is a crop loss, some heads have to roll. There has to be some, crop loss have to be made up by the salaries of the British officials who are responsible for the irrigation. Horticulture, building of more dams. He also made a strong case for ban on cow and oxen slaughter. But again, Phule is very clear that is not coming from any belief system. He actually makes a case that there is a shortage of livestock, and if we really have to eat, we could import more cattle and eat. But we need livestock. As far as education is concerned, in several places, Phule makes again a huge list of recommendations. So he goes to the Hunter Commission and says, look, make education compulsory for everybody till the class, till 12 years of age. Of course, that doesn't happen, and then Phule is angry at the Hunter Commission. But look at some of his recommendations would be extremely valid, even today. So he's saying, look, we need to have a large increase in the number of public schools. We need to have higher salaries to incentivize the teachers to actually, do their jobs properly. We need to have teachers from the same community as students, so they can understand and interact with them at the same level. We need to have scholarships and prizes, so to incentivize the letterless farmer to send their kids to school. He's arguing for schools for Mahar and Mang students. He's asking for female primary education. That is Phule's intervention. Now, of course, there are limitations in the sense that Phule's work is limited by his time. Phule, is writing in a situation where, independence has not gained, the demand for independence has not really gained currency. All the nationalist thinkers of his time are making a case for a reform. Phule is making the strongest case by far among all for a social reform to be accompanied by an economic reform. None of the other thinkers, come even close to even acknowledging, several of these issues and the fact that caste plays such a crucial role in this economic infrastructure. There are the limitations. For instance, Phule's work is not as empirical as, let's say, Naroji's or Ranade's or Dutt's. But what Phule actually does is that he talks about, not explicitly, but our reading is, Phule is pitching or talking about the idea of institutional or structural inequality. So it is definitely not the case of, a single individual or single community, but it is about, several structures, economic, ideological, cultural, creating a situation where advantage is accumulated at one end and disadvantage at the other. So, structural inequality is at the heart of Phule's analysis. And with this, we return to the original question that we started with. And the quote is again on your screen. Is Phule's thought worthy of being included along with those of these early nationalist thinkers, the early economists? Is Phule an economist? Can we as economists, appropriate Phule? And we feel it would be a gross injustice if we don't. There cannot be an Indian economics, there cannot be an Indian economic thought without Phule and the other anti-caste thinkers. And it is high time that, it is incorporated in, economics among other disciplines. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishan and Saket. I think clearly again, the point at which social reform to be accompanied by economic reform, Bhugle's argument, very important quote, I thought, because, in 1950, our planning and economic changes after 1950 were clearly one of the most ambitious among all developing countries. But it's kind of a puzzle why, despite all those big investments in new technologies, including the IITs that we see today, why the benefits were not spread across. I guess the main reason was, it was socially very narrow, the scope of those changes. And I guess both these discussions today morning, in this session, help us understand why the narrow social base of the changes. So we'll move to the last speaker, Amit.
Thank you for inviting me, and congratulations on the second iteration of this very important and timely, I would say, reparations as a compensatory or a policy tool for the marginalized in India is something which has not been thought of in many circles. If you look at the Constituent Assembly debates, even there you do not find a mention of compensation for the marginalized people, and I'll talk a bit about that. So, what I'm going to talk about is the need to think about reparations as something new for any minority in India, and for each minority, you'll have to create its own case. In here, I'm going to talk about Dalits. I'm going to take the case of Dalits as a minority and try and put a case for reparations for them. Why do they need reparations? What does reparation mean? How is it similar and different from compensation or restitution? And a little bit with reservations. And what are the arguments that have been put forth internationally, philosophically, for reparations, and can those be applied to the Indian case? So let me start with reservations, which is the biggest kind of policy mechanism we have, which is also seen as a compensatory mechanism and something which addresses continuing exclusion and discrimination and has given access to educational institutions, legislature, and the government jobs. And I think without reservation, it would have been impossible to see people from the marginalized community sitting here in elite institutions of education or elsewhere. Even now, we know that in IIT there are about 700, faculty, out of which only about 24 or 25 come from the reserve category. And I can go on and on about other institutions. So despite reservation, the access is very limited. This is limited only to government sector jobs, which used to be 6% of the total quantum of employment. Now it's come down to 4 because of privatization and contractualization. And the entire private and informal sector is open to exclusion and discrimination. So I mean, here's 4% of the jobs. We're talking about reservation, and that's all we have. And this access starts at the time of independence, a little later. And this is 75 years of this policy. And you must understand that this access has been hard won by the marginalized people from a so-called starting point of nearly zero. And why do I say that? Because the argument is made that now you have to work hard and be meritorious, you have reservation, etc. But what is not talked about is they had to compete from almost nothing at the dawn of independence, because as many speakers have talked about, historically, if you see and you look at Manu, Smriti, or any other religious texts, that the Dalits in this case do not have land rights to own land, accumulate wealth, accumulate assets. Manusmriti says if a Dalit or a Shudra accumulates wealth, it gives pain, physical pain to the Brahmins. So that's where it starts. No access to good income earning occupations, there's no occupational mobility, education is denied, human, social, civil, political rights are denied. And this is what exists at the dawn of independence, and we don't realize that, and I'm going to make a case for that. And along with this, you have untouchability, segregation, and forced caste slavery, which is something is not talked about or thought of. In my research in the last 4 or 5 years, I and others have come to the realization that caste slavery is something which is not talked about, and its impact not really acknowledged, and that is something I'm going to also refer to here. And if you look at caste-based exclusion through untouchability and caste-based slavery, it is the longest historic exploitation, exclusion, or discrimination of a group anywhere in the world, except for gender-based exclusion and discrimination of any group in the world. You compare it to any other group, the Romas, the descendants of the African American slave trade, anywhere. It's one of the longest. And in a consultation we had at Harvard, we had 10 groups, which you can see on the screen, who were making the case for reparations to be now thought of as a serious policy mechanism to redress the historic wrongs for the African American descendants of slaves, the black population of apartheid South Africa, descendants of Caribbean slaves, the Roma Romani people of Europe, women who are victims of war and conflict. There was a case made for their reparation. Native American and Canadian indigenous people, the Congolese people. Congo was the colony of the Belgian King Leopold, who used to cut off people's hands. Latin America till 1843, where the British formally then passed an anti-slavery law, and I'll come to that. So this is the what. So what we found basically is that, I mean, we are limited by access to documentations. If you look at the African American case, they have very good documentation of slave owners, the cotton plantations, how many slaves were there, what was paid to them, etc., etc. So they really have a very good access to historical documentation to make a very strong case for reparations. We don't have that. We have to rely on the work done by historians, which is actually quite good. And some the Mughal period, there is hardly anything, and more work needs to be done here. But what we find is that, at least in the mention in the work done so far, there are no interventions by the state during the Mughal period or before that, which systematically try to attack caste as a social and a governance system, and it continues uninterrupted through the Mughal period, through the British period, till we come to 1843, where the British, because the abolitionist movement is happening back at home, they pass an anti-slavery law in 1833 in the British Parliament. But they take another 10 years to do the same in India, because India is the jewel in the crown. They need the slaves and the agrestic slaves to extract the surplus. So in fact, the governor at that time writes a letter to the East India Company saying, no, the slavery is very benign. It is very nice. It's a symbiotic relationship. The master also helps the slave during times of distress and famine, etc. It is not as harsh and as violent as the transatlantic slave trade and other trades. So you can take your while deciding what to do about it. So that letter is there. One can read it. So here is, I wish this was a little more clearer, but this is from a work done by Christina Molfenter. This is part of a PhD thesis and also a book. She compiles the estimates of slaves in India from 1807 to 2016. And you can see the first estimate for British India is 1841. That is 15 million slaves. They are termed as slaves. This is in Adam. And Adam's estimates are anywhere between 10 to 20 million slaves during British India. These are caste slaves, mostly. And this goes on and on. You can see the next is 1873. This is a 5 million slave population. And the terminology changes after 1947. Now they are called agricultural serfs and bonded labor, etc. But this is the same community of caste slaves who have been traditionally working as serfs, agrestic slaves through the British period and even before that. So it's very safe to assume that at the dawn of independence, you have this 20 million, and I think that's an underestimate, a population of slaves who have never been compensated. They've just been on paper termed now as they lose their slave status, but have they really lost their slave status is the question. So I'll come to this point a little later. So let me quickly talk about the idea of reparation, compensation, and restitution. So compensation is sounds similar to reparation and restitution, but it is merely covering any loss or harm or damage that was caused by either a wrongdoing or not. So you can have an accident, someone dies in an accident, and that person is compensated by the state. There's a wrongdoing, or there is a natural calamity and the state also compensates you. So there is no necessary condition for there being a wrongdoing. You're just simply compensated in kind or cash or whatever. It's a sense of the person feels that he or she is no worse off than she or he was before this event occurred. So it's a broader term. Restitution simply means restoration of something lost or stolen to its rightful owner. It is conditional on separation of something from its rightful owner. So, it does not always take for granted that a wrongdoing has occurred in this act of separation. So, for example, if a person B steals person B's bike and simply returns it back without any explanation why he or she took it, or apologizes, or expresses remorse, etc., one can say restitution has happened, the thing has been restored, but not reparation. Uh, Reparation can only happen only after any loss or damage has occurred from a wrongdoing. So that's the condition. It is also a cluster of rights, while restitution is not always a right. So in the last example, if A was to return the bike to this person and also apologize for the wrongdoing, then one can say that reparation has happened, as B now feels that not only has the bike been returned, but the apology also quells her emotional distress, and she now feels satisfied. So there is an element of apology also included in it. So, but in the above example, if suppose the bike is lost, and A then apologizes to B for having stolen the bike but not being able to return it, and B feels it's okay, fine, I forgive you. So in that case, again, also reparation has happened without restitution, the stolen item being returned. So it's a little bit of a. Now, we can credit John Locke way back in 17th century, 1860. He writes this in 1689 for being the first to propose a cogent argument for reparations. His propositions have formed the basis for many subsequent arguments put forth by Black reparations and others. And he believed that people have natural rights, that they derive directly from natural law. These rights were equal for all, and that people were naturally disposed to live in peace and harmony. I mean, one can contest that, one may believe that or not. You can say it's a Hobbesian state, and there's conflict and chaos, etc. But I'm inclined to believe Hobbes on this. Sorry, Locke on this, not Hobbes. If these natural rights are violated, then to discourage the defiance of these natural rights of people, he proposes punishment. Punishment must be administered, and I quote, with so much severity as will suffice to make it an ill bargain for the offender, give him cause to repent, and terrify others from doing the like. So if a harm has been committed, the natural rights of people have been violated, then punishment is what Locke proposes. And to restore the harm that crime commonly causes some person or other, Locke proposes reparations. He states reparations must give the satisfaction due to any private man for the damage he received. So for him, the right to reparations emerges from the right to self-preservation. And these rights could be demanded only against the goods and services of the offender. So the person who offends or destroys these rights, then that person is liable to pay the reparations from his or her goods and services. This implies that the victim of a wrongdoing has a right to reparation only from the wrongdoer. And that's something which can be a problem, and we'll get to that. This, however, does not imply that the recipient must be made the immediate victim of the wrong. He was of the opinion that a crime usually harms some person or other. So if a person is killed and that if the person is there no more, then how do you, who gets the reparation? But Locke says and mentions that the crime usually harms a person or other. So, for example, if a girl's parents are murdered, she has a claim to reparations for the harm and the ensuing hardship of life that this act causes her. Even when a harm does not lead to material loss for the victim, it causes damage to the victim's self respect and moral standing, and she deserves, on part of the wrongdoer, an admission of the harm done, an apology. And if all this requires the wrongdoer to be punished, then repentance and reparations for the victim may also include punishment. So it's a cluster of rights. There can be an apology, repentance is required, a compensation or reparation is required, and if restitution is possible, that can also be done. So this is all from case to case. However, he makes a distinction between the right to reparation and the right to punish, and he gives the right of punishment to the state, not to the person who's a victim. Uh, Even when the wrongdoer does not gain materially from the act or harm, reparations are due to the victim for a mental, personal, psychological satisfaction. And in the event the wrongdoer gets enriched, then reparation may include restitution or compensation. Okay, I'm going to quickly now talk about a few arguments which also substantiates what Locke says and have been used in the reparations debate, and then I'll stop. First is the harm argument, and the harm argument relies on the idea that the transgressions of, say, slavery, or in this case, caste untouchability, caste enslavement, initiated an unbroken chain of harms linked as cause and effect that began with the ex-untouchables or the ex-enslaved and their descendants and continues amongst the Indian Dalits to the present day. So the harm which was caused to the ancestors is not it's not done and over with them, but it leads to a effect of a cause and effect which is transferred intergenerationally in so many different ways, economically, socially, psychologically, etc., which seems that the argument made by anti-repression arguers is that it was in the past, it is done. What problems do you have? You live in a free society. You have all equal rights, etc. But the harm is passed on, and this is a very important thing which Boxell makes. This argument is made to justify reparations for the present day descendants of slavery or caste enslaved and near slavery of ex-untouchables, and in equal measure for any present group who it could be the Romani, it could be the native, whose ancestors in the past faced similar extreme harm. The second is the inheritance argument, and it argues that once you recognize that a harm was done and you emancipated the slaves or freed the people, these people had rights to reparation. If you accepted a crime is done, then what is usually the case? You punish the wrongdoer, you compensate the people for the injustices, but this never happened. For instance, the descendants of after the emancipation of the slaves in America, it was Lincoln said that we would try and give 40 acres and a mule to every family, and some families received it, but later on it was also taken away from them. So that kind of compensation was never thought of or talked about or by even the British in India when they passed the anti-slavery law. So there they have that right, and that right is passed down. If you are unable to pay that to the ancestors, the descendants inherit that right. Inheritance argument says that. And when the British in 1843 made slavery illegal, they did not define slavery. They were very smart. They, in fact, just under the IPC, they made abduction, trafficking, bodily harm, and forced labor illegal, which all together means slavery. And but they left it up to the magistrates and the judicial magistrate to interpret each case. If someone is used as a slave and goes to the court against it, whether it's slavery or not. So they were also very smart. But they never announced any kind of reparations or compensation for these freed slaves, or made their masters liable for the same. So in that sense, the British owe us reparations as well for the 10 years they took for this delay in passing this law, and having passed the law, not announcing any kind of compensation. And when on paper these slaves are kind of freed, but they have no claim on any land, any compensation, they have to continue to work with their masters, now as attached, bonded, or indentured labor. So that harm continues. You just have changed the terminology. And last, and I'll stop with that, is the spiritual renewal argument, which says that while compensation and restitution are essential and the starting point in the process of healing and reconciliation, true reparations would demand, in addition, that there is also an acceptance of historical crimes and injustices, and that these have led to a causal chain of events that carried forward and affected and continues to the lives of the descendants and the victims of untouchability and caste enslavement. And this is a quote from Mr. Coates, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he says, what I'm talking about is more than a recompense for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. Reparations would mean a revolution of the American consciousness, a reconciling of our self-image as a great democratizer with the facts of our history. And this applies to any case, and to India, that you accept that there is a historic wrong being done, you apologize for it, and you compensate for it. Thank you. I'll stop.
Thank you, Amit. Quite fascinating discussion. I was just one thing at one point you were saying about how the British Indian governor delayed the implementation of the anti-slavery law in India because, to maintain the reserve army of labor. I think post-independent India, we didn't implement land reforms. You talk about land reparations. We also do not have a system of social security. In a way, one should wonder whether this is throughout all these years after 1947, was this actually part of this larger scheme of maintaining this reserve army of labor, because to keep the workers vulnerable and assetless. So with that note, we will thank you again. Thank you all the speakers. So we have some time, I believe, for discussion. So please.
And I'm particularly interested in the part where you are trying to trace the history of reparation to Lockean thought. And I was just wondering, John Locke's Leviathan, which I think is the book that you referred to in 1689, has a section called Off Property. And that particular section has been critiqued by several scholars, like Paul Corcoran, for having supported the political fiction of terra nullius and its role in propagating colonial violence in Australia. And also Locke, although he himself gives a sufficient right to self-preservation of the individual, he also gives overriding rights to the sovereign of the Commonwealth, ultimately. So I was just wondering whether in this kind of thought experiment, we could trace an alternative genealogy that's comprising of, say, Dalit and indigenous theoreticians for understanding this kind of scholarship on reparative justice. I really like the reference to Sanal P. Mohan. I reference him a lot in understanding caste slavery. But I was also wondering, somebody like Megan Davis, who is an Australian legal philosopher, and she was crucial in formulating the Uluru Statement in Australia, whether we could maybe go to this model through an alternative genealogy of scholarship. Thank you.
What qualifies as something which is right or something which is wrong. And my question is, what do you think is the state of the right to reparation between groups with differing sense or principles of morality? For example, take the case of colonization, where colonization signifies something which is good for the progress, for the education or civilization of the colonized. But then again, for the people, like for instance, for the tribal groups or the indigenous communities, it is seen as something which is a disruption, like an invasion, and in many sense, abolition of certain customs.
Please give your name as well.
Yeah, sure. It came up right now. This is directed to Professor Amit Thorat. I do find a problem in this neat historical timeline that you're sort of building, which is around around the macro narrative of how slavery and caste has gone hand in hand. Uh, First, this is being conflated with a very modern notion of the state, and I think that itself is very problematic when you try to put it across, say, all the periods, especially the Mughal period. So that is what I wanted to start off with. But just to take a point on the reparations bit, a century before Locke's conceptualization of reparation itself, there's this Muslim text that comes up in South India where he speaks of two things, at least two things that I would like to point out. So one is low caste conversions to Islam, and this is primarily from the Cherma community that you actually did show. And this is a century, so this is the 16th century, and they are converting precisely to move away from caste oppression. But there is also something else that's happening. There is some kind of financial support system which Muslims are also pooling in, in terms of resources, in terms of support, and somewhere this is also extended to the concept of waqf itself. So I was also wondering if, prior to reparations, is there a thought that might have also gone into the making of whatever we can understand in terms of just thinking of these histories? Thank you.
Okay, one question here, Divya, and then
Sarkar back, and the Jharkhand Sarkar and the Indian government is totally worthless. So, which roughly translates to that our queen was very nice, and the Jharkhand government and the Indian government is worthless. So, do you find any similarities between the observations of Mr. Mehto and Dadabhai Nauroji, and what do you make of it? And my second question is for Professor Jayan. A week ago, Cora Abraham wrote a piece for Cora Abraham wrote a piece on the Ural Lungal Construction Workers Cooperatives 100 years. The piece was titled From Caste Struggles to Cyber Park. So, can you tell us, in context to this discussion, what went right in the journey of Urarangar Workers Cooperative, and I mean, what's not so rosy about it, especially its establishment by a Hindu reformer called Bag Bhatnanda?
Divya, yeah, and then
archives of a particular period in a particular region, but through your very fine-grained analysis shows a certain dynamic, which we have suspected in some other cases as well, that in fact much of the modern caste discourse, which borrows from the developing racialized discourses from Europe, as Sarla Devi does, is directly being shaped by anti-caste pressure. And if you can explain, so you gave the example of Bhagya Reddy Verma, but there, if you can also explain more conceptually the dynamic of how this pressure actually helps to give rise to these new discourses. I mean, for me, it's a direct evidence of what I have been exploring as homology. There's real material consequences, reciprocal actions. And my question to Ishan and Saket was that, you're diagnosing this absence of a voice from the margins in the discourse, once again, of, say, Ajit Dasgupta. That was one prominent example that you both gave. Can you tell us, in your reading of maybe the larger corpus of such writers, or just Dasgupta, if you can trace exactly where do they feel the same pressure, which I think is a common point in both the presentations, that do you think that that someone like Dasgupta is actively responding to a pressure which the rest of us at least are not able to read, but maybe you can? So when he says that we can't include all the voices in the canon, whose charges is he anticipating or silently responding to? Because that itself is a suppressed voice in the history of canon formation of economic thought.
Sunny, Yashpal, Arifa, Sunny.
His defense of slavery and defense of empire. I mean, this quote that I just reminded of from the chapter on property in his two theories of government, that the grass my horse has bit, the turf my servant has cut, the ore I have digged in any place where I have a right to them in common with others, hath fixed my property in them. So he sources individual property from the labor of servants and from taking over the commons. And everything else is a defense of that. So in that, and it goes on to his idea of improvement, his philosophical defense of slavery, legal defense of slavery in the Constitution of Louisiana and stuff like that. But still, as you said, from within the liberal theory, we can still see these contradictions. So wouldn't it be right to frame it as an internal contradiction in law for liberal theory generally, rather than simply drawing from liberal theory? And now for Ishan, I would suggest that if you can we push the question of caste and the investigation of question of caste in history of economic thought to say a common ground or of the story of 19th and earlier 20th century, where classical economics is emerging and liberating itself away from political economy, which was more conducive to actually accepting and engaging caste when dealing with the peasant question. And I'm reminded of a lot of writings by British administrators, Herbert Risley, Malcolm Darling's Punjab Peasant and in Debt and Poverty, or Denzel Ibbotson. All of these people were writing about peasant in a very political economic language, and through that they started enumerating caste, and a lot of literature that we have on 19th century caste and the economic and social details comes from that literature. I mean, a lot of historians call that the ethnographic state or whatever, but they addressed it and the nationalists did not. So, I mean, that connection can be explored.
And his thought and his contributions. Especially, I was reminded of Sharad Patil, who did treat Phule, I think, for the first time as a philosopher and tried to position him as a philosopher independently along with Ambedkar and Marx. So, what I thought in terms of the way you positioned Phule as an economic thinker, which the economists have missed out on, I thought the Phule's contributions could be presented in a more, I sense, strong manner, more strongly and more clearly in terms of the way Phule has invoked slavery as a system of exploitation and governance, and used that model to make sense of untouchability over here, which is an argument that how untouchability forms an economic system which Ambedkar builds on later. So that's very clearly economic thinking, where Phule presents a theory of exploitation. And on the basis of that theory of exploitation, now he's not simply doing some small scale rhetorical argument, and that's where many scholars have misunderstood Phule, that he's not engaging in rhetoric, he's building a theory, and he has a very clear coherent vision of what are the ideals that we need to look out for. So he is building a theory of exploitation, and he is treating Brahmins not simply as a social community, he is treating Brahmins as an economic community. And on that basis, he is also demanding various other sorts of outcomes for people, such as demand, and his whole emphasis on equality also translates in having fair labor value for people. So we see that there is a coherent theory, that is economic theory, that is emerging in Phule, which I think economists have missed out. So the question is, what are the consequences? Do you have any plan or any ideas to follow up with the consequences of missing out on this sort of a theorization by anti-caste thinkers? What were the consequences in terms of the way economic thought has developed in India?
On the aspect of economic analysis by Phule State in acting against the anti-caste, anti-race struggle or in reproducing new architectures of inequality? Is it detrimental to the repartition project that you're talking about? To give an example, Malcolm X's biography by Alex Haley cites what happens to littles with this whole welfare state coming to their doors, the impact it had on the psychology of the mother and the children also. So do you think, is it detrimental to the repartition project, the welfare state?
I hope I'm audible. I have two quick thoughts. First to Dr. Amit. Maybe a devil's advocate here. For it's 75 years of independence, entering the 76th year, and we still are doubting if we need reservation in the first place. And so, in a country like us, where it's so difficult to just get the reservation argument across, where we do not even have a public apology till date, where there is no accountability of caste slavery, and I mean I have philosophers in the room, but like when the reservation argument comes, the the whole seat argument, and that's something almost intangible, and when you have ownership on an intangible thing, like it's my seat and how can someone take my seat. Now when it comes to a tangible argument like money, how do we sort of deal, and I'm asking is how do we, like, let's say the argument is strong, it gets passed as a public policy, but how do we practically implement it without social boycott and etc.
Please give your names also at the beginning.
And I'm also going to ask a question to Professor Amit. I couldn't help but think of Proudhon's properties theft, and I was wondering how ownership would then complicate the idea of, this something is being taken from somebody and then you have to return it. But if we complicate the idea of ownership in the first place, as thinkers like Proudhon have done, then how would that feature in this debate? And second, I think it's related to the question that was asked before. I was thinking about reparation, and then if you're thinking about things like self-esteem and maybe humiliation or forgiveness, does the idea of reparation also then impose some kind of exchange value on these things? And, how could we think about that? Thank you.
Kind of a thing to Professor Amit. It is about, like, when we ask about reparation for historical injustice, there is one question of agency, whom we will ask for reparation. So it will surely be not an agency which we will ask to an individual that you did this loss to me. It will be a collective responsibility. So what will be the nature of asking the reparation? Like, how we will make sense of it?
My question is, so is he differentiating Harijans, means Harijan term given by Mr. Gandhi? So is he differentiating so-called untouchable community, high class or low class? So whom is including in high class Harijan and whom is including a low class Harijan?
When you said about reparation, I think it was a very novel idea to bring forward. Although the quote by Anand Teltumble was like roaming in my head, which said that if reparations for historical wrongs were on the agenda, not illegitimately as one may think today, the country would have to be sold 1,000,000 times over to raise the amount.
True.
So it is quite unfathomable for me to even think about the idea of reparation, because the amount of violence we listen to on caste basis every day. So what would your take be on it?
My questions to Amit sir. My name is Hyder Ali. Amit sir, talk about the right and all other things. If I was going through the books which is written by Mahmood Mamdani, Neither Settler and Nor Native, where he talk about the reparations of African American, but when you come to talk about the Indian Americans, where in 1960 the reparations was given to the African American, but the right was denied to the Indian American. And when you come to if you come to the India, the similar kind of happenings now. So how do you look that? that question. Thank you.
A kind of injustice, and you can produce evidence. So, in that context, like as a social scientist, how we try to probably collaborate with the biologist or say epigenetist, and maybe we can think about in a future sense where probably our theory of reparation can complement their project.
I think that's enthusiastic interest in something I've just begun to explore. So please excuse my ignorance and incompetence in answering all your questions. So I don't think I can take each question. I'm going to just address many of the questions are clubbed. If I miss something, please you can ask them again. About log. So yes, I mean it is problematic to evoke everything about log, but I think we're just trying to create a basic theory, a liberal theory or history of liberal theory, and trying to work with that. And I agree there are a lot of other as theorizations about why reparations or compensations are due, and thank you for suggesting some of them. But the problem is, these are also context specific and group specific. You have ethnicity, you have descent based on work, on lineage, all kinds of notions of identity get conflated. So, and argumentations have been made according to particular group specificities and what has happened to them historically. I was reading a report on Africa, and it seems there are 54 countries in Africa, and half of them have a caste system, and the hierarchies are very different. But there are hierarchies. There is slavery still going on. The slavery is both hereditary as well as families whose ancestors were captured as slaves. There is slavery of women. There is slavery of children. So to come up with, just maybe yes, we have to think of a plethora of different theoretical formulations to address all of these different groups. But I'm just starting out here, so it will take some time to navigate the entire field of theoretical formulations to justify reparations. So I'm just starting out, and this is what I engage with to begin with. So please excuse my. I'm an economist, right? So this is just. So please bear that in mind. Yeah, it'll take some time, and I might need your help. Okay. There were some questions which I did not understand, but it is not an easy question. Let me just. In the Indian context, there have been conversions to Islam and Christianity, and people have tried to escape their caste identities, right? And some of them have managed to, if you look at Christian converts, they have managed to access education, wealth, and managed to have intergenerational mobility. But in other communities, you see that is not the case. Even amongst Christians, you'll find that the priests come from a particular community, and others are still languishing. You have separate churches, separate gurudwaras, separate mosques for Qurayshis or other kind of Julahas, etc. So even within after conversion, there is and arguments can be made, because they may have gained something, but they still are suffering from this baggage, historic baggage, which doesn't sticky baggage. It's a very sticky baggage. It doesn't go, and people have tried to get out of this misery and succeeded in some ways. But if we are making an argument for reparations for people and communities whose ancestors were systematically, socially, economically excluded, discriminated, etc., then we'll have to think of ways of extending that argument, not just to say the Neo-Buddhist or the Valmikis and Harijans, but if required to other minorities amongst other religious groups. Who pays the debt? So that's a good question. And how much can we pay? Just because it'll have to, we'll have to sell the country 3 times over doesn't mean we just don't do it. But there are various formulations of the idea. The state pays. You have a cess for many things. You have a cess. People who have benefited from 2000 years of systematic exclusion of particular communities can pay. Why can't we think of that? What's the problem? We pay tax. If you have more income, you pay tax. It should be like that. And we can think of ways in which particular communities pay something, contribute. So the state can pay, the people can pay, the Britishers can pay. I mean, us for some. I mean, Shashi Tharoor is all game for it, for the colonial exploitation. Why not add a component of caste reparations into that? What's the problem? Sorry, let me just. The many questions I'm not talking about, I'm getting. There was a question about the African American descendants of slavery versus the native tribes. Can you can you repeat that, please?
Yes, I am.
Yes, please. Can you? Yeah.
So-
Can you please repeat that?
So the question is that if you look that as here the LED is not visible for me, and earlier you have list of the things which has happens, means you in the list American, African, apartheid.
I got it. So in the commission, there was a case made by this person, Mr. John at Harvard. He's a Native American, and there are about 400 to 500 native tribes. Now, how do you make a collective case for reparations for them? So he just made a case for one tribe, and he just traced what happened to that tribe through the genocide, violence, pushing them into reservation land, and again taking their reservation land, pushing them somewhere else. And it was an extremely, extremely powerful case. He just needed one case study to make the case. And you had another set of people making a case for the descendants of the African American slave trade, whose ancestors were trafficked to America, not later migrants.
Yeah.
You have those records. You know that. So it's not. I don't think there's a problem across these two.
I want to add, if you see the numbers, the 15% the African Americans. When you come to, if I will read the Will Kimlicka book written by Multiculturalism, where he talk about the French native was living over there. So how do you look that means to identify the rights of Indian Americans?
Indian Americans? I'm not sorry if I follow you. Native, do you mean Native Americans?
Yes, Native Americans.
We'll talk.
Once again, I'll also not be able to take everything, but thanks a lot for your comments. We are also at the initial stages of developing this, but I think the consequences. So first of all, we are not trying to reduce Fule to an economist. That is definitely not what we are trying to do. What we are trying to do is to convince our tribe, economic historians of economic thought, that he's also an economist, and please do read them, because if you don't, then there are consequences, and one of the glaring consequences is, so if we look at how the planning documents, for instance, the first plan of Indian first 5-year plan, and anything to do with caste and redistribution comes on chapter 28 as an obscure. So we have not, as policy, taken this seriously, and I think that stems from the fact that our methodology of understanding caste is not embedded in economics. So we look at caste as an archaic system, as something that is residual of the past, of history, and it will go away with modernization, and that of course is not true. So that is something that, so answering to your question too, that is something that we draw from both Phule and Ambedkar. We also draw from them the understanding that caste and the reproduction of hierarchies and reproduction of inequality is not about an individual bias, or it's not merely about an individual bias, or one mean person sitting in a particular office. Rather, it is about the structures which could be legal, which could be Amit was talking about it. Bonded labor in India was abolished in 1976. So it is about legal structures, it is about social structures, it is about all kinds of structures that reproduce this hierarchy and inequality. So that is, I think, the essence of what we can take from both Phule and Ambedkar and apply to contemporary understanding of caste. Uh, I think Dasgupta and others, what they do is they, again, because of this understanding that caste will, it's not something that economists have to worry about. The culturalization of caste argument, if it is anything, it is to be restricted to the cultural or political domain, and economics is something that is not embedded in the social of a time. I think that is what these historians of economic thought believe in, which is why they have been ignored. Uh, yeah, so Singhbhum, East Singhbhum, I'm actually from there, from that district, and I did not present this paper there before, I promise you. But I think if somebody is saying that the Queen's rule was better, I think what it represents is the angst of the contemporary times. And of course, it's not compared to what Naroji is writing then, but to have such a similar anxiety after hundreds of years actually speaks volumes about how our policy has gone about viewing these questions. Two quick points. One, thanks Sunny for the comment. And yes, so classical political economy, Indian political economy did provide some sort of a framework to talk about caste. But since then, the methodological changes in economics, and we have moved to a much more individualistic understanding of the society. So there is no society in large part of the mainstream economics. It's a bundle of consumers and producers and individuals, which is where this framework comes in handy. And lastly, I missed one slide. I don't know why, but now that there is a captive audience, I think the point that I missed was Phule is actually amongst the first to raise a systematic demand for reservations. And his argument actually is very simple. He's saying, look, there are these educational institutes, there are these public offices where it has been completely monopolized by one community, and until and unless we have systematic proportionate representation, we will not be able to have democratization of these spaces. And he raises a demand which would be considered radical even today. He's saying there has to be a cap on the salaries and the pensions of the British and the Brahmin officials, and that money, the cap, the money that we get from the cap, that has to be redistributed. So extremely radical demands to address systemic inequalities. Thank you for your comments. Sorry, just Saket, if you would like to add something.
Not really. I just want to add a couple of points. One, as Ishan said, that historians of economic thought like Dasgupta have, when they are saying that not everybody can be included in the canon, they are actually referring to anti-caste thinkers. But also, one thing that has been missed from the entire debate is who were the nationalist thinkers in dialogue with. What was their contemporary opposition from the indigenous political space? And it was the anti-caste thinkers. It was Phule, and who has written directly and indirectly critiques of nationalist thinkers, that how they are actually not taking on the question of caste. And that is something that when Dasgupta and others who say that not everybody can be included in the canon, that is then can be taken to the other one was on Sharad Patil. Yes, Sharad Patil did look at Phule and Ambedkar as philosophers. Then later, in his later works, he sort of devises his own philosophy. He departs towards an more his own independent philosophical school. But I think the consequence of missing out on this sort of theorization by economic thinkers, and more specifically by anti-caste thinkers, is that rather is that this framework that has been developing through from Phule, and then there are other thinkers as well who are not, and actually we have been sort of looking into them. Other thinkers in the sense that who have been writing on political economy, have been writing on economy, but they have not been taken as a part of the canon. Why? Because they have been writing in either vernacular languages. They've not been writing in the sort of language that the nationalist thinkers have been writing. They are writing for a more mass audience, and that is something that determines who will be included in the canon. But also, from our point of view, when we look at it has actually been detrimental to the larger theorization of caste in the economic domain as such. And on the question by Sunny on classical economy and how it liberated itself from political economy in the 19th century. And you mentioned Risley and Ibbotson And also, I think the way the census was conducted, the way Hindu law was being codified at that time, and the way caste was, I mean, linking it to how caste was looked as a form of race by colonial authorities, and that is all coming in here. And I think there is work on how Phule sort of responded to these works by turning it on their head, turning the racialization of caste on its head by his entire the historical narrative that he weaves in slavery. So I think, yeah, that is something that can be explored, and we'll look into that.
Yeah, Divya, relating to a question about how this pressure on Hindu narratives expresses itself. Yeah, there was a considerable pressure from anti-caste politics on the views of Hindu leaders, and especially the link between the idea of a race war and how the idea of a race war between the original inhabitants and Aryans and the Varna order. Taking this cue, Bhagirath Varma actually problematized the presence of the fifth Varna. And he actually asked, how does the fifth Varna fit into the fourfold Varna order? So, due to this considerable pressure, Sarla Devi was responding to this. And actually, she actually gives kind of a reason for the presence of the fifth Varna. She says that when the Brahmin tussled with God, he got arrogant and he ended up creating the fifth Varna or untouchability. That was never the case earlier, because earlier Brahmanism was there, which looked after the eternal peace and prosperity of all, whereas the rise of the individual and greedy figure of the Brahmin corrupted Brahmanism and collapsed into the individual figure of the Brahmin. From Brahmanism to Brahmin explains the coming of the fifth Varna. So this explains that the pressure that you're asking about, and this pressure actually, as Saket was also pointing out, that actually with the rise of slavery as a vector, racialization was effectively subverted. And this also coincides with what Professor Yashpal was talking about, the rise of the humiliation rhetoric in Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's speeches, that from the arch from 1927-28 till 1936 is a very good arch to see that. And we see that race getting jettisoned, very importantly, by the Adi Hindu movement, and especially the Swastidal, the reform volunteer groups, subverting the ahimsa narrative in the public sphere of Hyderabad. So they asked that if this ahimsa narrative was applicable to the campaign in the removal of animal sacrifices and for instituting sattvic pujas, Brahminical rituals in subaltern temples, they asked, if your ahimsa extends only to animals and does not extend to humans, then what's the point of this ahimsa narrative? So they broadened the ahimsa narrative to include freedom. And this is the discourse we're talking about, and the imprint is seen. So, and also Sarla Devi was very right. Actually, she was seeing the eroding Brahmin moral leadership, because first of all, they got arrogant and they mocked Telugu speakers, which came under a common nationalist banner called the Andhra Janasangha. No, not Andhra Janasangha, some kind of Hyderabad nationalist grouping. So the Marathi Brahmins humiliated Telugu speakers. They cut off and went out from the Andhra Janasangha. Then they came to Dalits. Dalits also give it back to them through the Ahimsa narrative. And then afterwards, the Reddis, the dominant Shudras of Telangana and Andhra, Telangana especially, staged a spectacular coup and took away the presidency of the Harijan Sevak Sangh and all the general secretary positions from the Brahmins in 1934. So this is what, and also that was aided by their mouthpiece called the Golconda Patrika, where they waged a sustained ideological offensive against the Brahmins. So the field from 1922 and what Sarla Devi is reflecting in 1926 actually shows that some concern has to be expressed, and she was absolutely right. Yeah. And secondly, whom is Baji Krishnan Rao referring to as a high-class Harijan? In the correspondence, Baji Krishnan Rao referred to only Dr. Ambedkar as a high-class Harijan. So from there, we have to deduce what does actually he mean by these criteria. Is it well-educated, and Baba Sahib was a political leader, and what other occupation did Baba Sahib hold in 1935? As a barrister? As what is his status? So that's only, I think, probably the broad educated intelligentsia from Dr. Ambedkar, P.R. Venkateswamy, Bhagirath Varma, and other educated Youth League of Ambedkar members and the coming Ambedkar leadership. I think probably he's referring to them as this one. So a mix of politics or any leader in contemporary this one will be considered as a so-called, always in quotations, high-class Harijan. So, and yeah, that's the thing.
Thank you. I think that
Can I
brings.
just quickly respond to one? How do we practically implement this, right? So there are lots of models out there, and if you take land as a asset, you take wealth as a matrix, you take education as a matrix. There are already some schemes which mimic that. But if you target those to particular communities, so Ambedkar never talks about land redistribution because he thinks the land reforms would work, but they don't. It's only S. Nagappa who, in the Constituent Assembly, says that 10 acres of dry land and 10 acres of irrigated land and 20 acres of dry land should be given to every Harijan family, and that is the only time you hear about a reparative kind of a demand in being made. But if in Telangana recently they did a policy implementation where 10 lakh rupees was transferred to Dalit families, and there's a study out which evaluates its impact, and they find that it enormously increased their economic stability and economic earning potential because of that transfer. They got they got more respect in the village, etc. At the same time, because of this transfer of wealth, it also led to more friction or kind of So it's gonna go hand in hand. I mean, what do you want? You want to wait for the society to change and people's mindset to change and their benevolence to happen, or you want to be compensated for the wrongs that have happened in history and work with that? So I thought that Telangana scheme was important to mention.
Thank you. I think that brings us to a close to this very stimulating discussion, very excellent presentations, and I'm very encouraging response from all of you. So many questions. If I can just take exactly 1 minute, I will use Ritik's question to bring to emphasize this point about the centrality of politics in all this, because you were asking the question about Kerala and your slide about Christina's show that Kerala was also one of the regions with a very high, the region that is today's Kerala was a region with a high degree of agrarian inequality and agristic slavery. But that clearly changed after 1956. Clearly, a lot of it has to do with the politics of the state. Land reforms, reasonably successful, large investments in education and health, and which we know, big changes have happened. And I think the last, because you talked about reparations, I believe a discussion on those should begin with, instituting a form of social security in India. If you look at most of the migrant workers, a large part of them belong to disadvantaged communities. So let's start with decent wages for these workers and health and education. Perhaps I guess that will be the beginning of reparations, but I'm not so sure whether. Yeah, so I think that's it. Thank you all. Yeah, you want to say that?
I mean those are standard practices which should anyways be implemented. Decent wages, it's not implemented. But I am talking about compensating for a historic wrong, because that continues and that adds up to present disadvantage. That's all.
Thank you. With that, we have come to an end of the very engaging and reflective series of talks, presentations, as well as participation from the audience. And before we conclude the second edition of the CPCR conference, I would like to invite Professor Divya Dwivedi for the concluding remarks and a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Nove. I would like to make a few closing remarks before the vote of thanks. And first of all, I would like to say that critical philosophy of caste and race, some of you who've been part of this journey from last year and before that with the special issue know in what practical ways philosophy is the discipline that sort of is named, not only because it's the oldest, continues to bleed into new disciplines, but as we saw even in the last two sessions of the conference, that there is a need to think together. And there is also a need to decompartmentalize philosophy. The best philosophy, the most thought-provoking, and even the worst, which produced race theories, justifications for casteism, has always had its hands dirty, or in the Foucauldian sense had dirt under the fingernails. And I think that is the philosophy, that decompartmentalized philosophy, under whose title we are actually performing a very multidisciplinary meditation together with each other. Another point that has come through in this conference is of time, including in the question of reparations, which is a problem of time, both past and future, that not only are these discussions, these researches timely, but actually they are also belated. And as Yashpal said in his opening address, welcome address, on the one hand, it's absolutely clear why caste is, just like various forms of racism, is an entrenched social evil that should be fought, that should have been fought and removed. And yet there are differing perspectives, and these perspectives are also actively invested in the forgetting of caste, the denial of caste, and the obstruction of forms of justice. And therefore, I don't think we are belated. I mean, if we think we are belated, it only puts more pressure on us to continue to do this kind of work, which across the panels, if I may summarize very crudely, seems to involve 3 or 4 kinds of moves. One is of documentation, which is being done across disciplines. The second is of a very political form of memory, which goes back to archives, both those that are buried and invisibilized and those that have been more dominant and operative. And thirdly, those archives that require more interpretation, that require their genius to be unearthed for their potential. And so I think on behalf of Lenny and Yashpal, I may safely say that we are very proud, we are very pleased, because we've learned a lot from every presentation. And so CPCR has at least begun as a space for presenting exciting new research. We are hoping to publish both the previous and this year's proceedings, but we are also very keen to host and publish research which may not have been presented. So if you have any suggestions for work you've done, please don't hesitate to contact us. The second is that both the caste reality and the anti-caste reality, as well as discourses, have been given a very incisive analysis throughout these 3 days, and I think all of us are students in this room. We've touched on economic thought, on the very history of historiography, on social psychology, which marks a grand new beginning in humanities and social sciences. Shall we call it the dark continent in the dark continent? We could go on with Freudian jokes. But I think these researches which all of you contributed also have given us new strategies of reading, like Chanel presented today, also generating new the discovery of new elements, as well as of older elements that we hadn't understood well. The posing of some very difficult questions, some of which we don't often dare to utter, like Professor Gajendran said, what more can we think about the word Dalit, using it or not using it? These are some of the most courageous new avenues for thinking. And I think finally a very, very powerful force is being generated on this floor for the revision of canon and syllabi, because we don't teach this stuff. I think conferences and publications are almost the only venue where we can have these discussions, and that's too little, if not also too late. So with that, Florence, Nove, Prashant, Gopika, Pratishtha, Nidhi, Sonam, Juveria, Rohan, Rishabh, Vimal, Alia, Mansi. Also, these are some young master's students from our new Masters in Culture Society and Thought. There are also students from, I think, MSc Cognitive Science and Economics who have been part. Then, first of all, of course, to start the thanks to the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Institute. This time we got very generous funds, though they are never easy to sort of secure and then to spend. Spending is very hard. And for our head of department who opened the conference. Then thank you to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, but in particular the Initiative for Caste Equity, which is led by Professor Jogband, because they funded our keynote address and allowed us to have no less than Professor Meena Dada to open the conference. Also, thanks to Meena and Zainab, because we could not entirely fund their presence, so the journey to India and to New Delhi was through their own efforts, and that's very generous of you. Also, you know, Meena is a someone in very high demand in Delhi, so we have been able to have her here exclusively for 3 days, which we are very grateful for. Locked Zainab for coming all the way from Turkey to share. We often speak of Global South, but how frequently do we actually have the Global South, at least here in India? I would also like to thank all the speakers who have come from outside Delhi, have spared the time. In a couple of cases, just because of our own faults and flaws, we were not able to issue the final invitation on time, but we still were able to enlist your presence and participation. This is especially for Abhilash and for Saket, so thank you for being here in person. To all the colleagues for chairing and for lending your solidarity actually to this new initiative. Finally, to the HSS office staff who have been very, very helpful, most importantly in securing venue. There are many stories behind that. Also for the staff of the seminar hall and for the Senate hall, which is a wonderful space, which I think we've almost occupied for 3 days. Also the ODI staff, and I must in particular mention Tushar. I don't know if he's here, but he has been extremely helpful in putting together these 3 days. Also the ETSC staff for the recording and for excellent connectivity. And finally for the audience, which has asked us very difficult, persistent questions, and I have a record certainly in my notebook for all of them. Because these are the questions of our own community which we must answer, each from our own social location. So thank you. Sorry for having eaten 1.5 hours into the lunch. Your patience and enthusiasm. And I hope you have a nice weekend. And I hope you come to CPCR3 next year. Yes. Oh, yes, that's right. I think our most privileged guest from Germany, Professor Gajendran Ayature, who has been a constant presence online and has sent comments and even private messages of encouragement throughout. So thank you, Gajendran, and we'll meet soon. See you next year in CPCR 3.
Thank you everyone.